Gwe Nintelise, Julia Rose Sutherland. Hi, my name is Julia Rose Sutherland. I'm an interdisciplinary artist, and I am an enrolled citizen of the Metepenagiag Nation of Red Bank, New Brunswick, so-called Canada. My relationship to OCAD is that I'm an assistant professor here. I'm tenure track, and I'm cross-appointed in 2 different faculties. So I'm in the Faculty of Design and the Faculty of Arts. I teach material art and design textiles, as well as Indigenous visual culture. I believe my work definitely touches on language on multiple faceted ways, actually. So I have 2 pieces in the exhibition. One is a quillwork piece, and as a Metepenagian Mi'kmaq woman, quillwork is something that has been passed down to me intergenerationally. So it's a material that we use, have used since time immemorial. And so it's something that I'm thinking about a lot in terms of how do I use these skills that have been taught to me by my lovely family members, in particular my great aunt Betty Ann, and then how do I reinvigorate them into contemporary cultures. So I'm using it in a non-traditional sense, but I am using it in a way to learn my language. So I'm a non-native speaker of my mother tongue, and I believe to me that this is a sign of colonialism, that I don't speak my mother tongue. I'm very fortunate that I have lots of language teachers within my community, and through my art practice I'm trying to learn my traditional language, and not to just learn the words or the syntax, but to learn what they mean in an embodied blood memory kind of way. So it's a porcupine quill piece where the porcupines are actually embedded directly into the drywall. And so this work, one, talks about assertion of traditional materials, traditional language. It reads out a Mi'kmaq term that translated means time of acquiring learning, or ginimekik. And this piece is really important to me because it's talking about the institutions in ways, so it's pointing out institutional harm, but it's also pointing out assertion of traditional Indigenous language, tradition, and culture. So it's a little antagonistic in some ways, but it's also really subtle and really beautiful. I think it talks about embedded memory, it talks about the institution in different ways, but I think it talks about our assertion that we are here and that our language lives on. And then the other piece is actually perhaps more antagonistic in some ways, and it's a little bit more playful as well. So the piece translates to rotten. So if you come to the gallery, you'll probably be met by many jars of sugar popsicles that are the shape of my tongue, my personal tongue, that look like they've been almost taken from the mouth or serrated from the mouth and put on a popsicle stick. And this one is a little bit more clinical in a way, and it's really speaking towards the healthcare system in Canada and how it's not so integrated in helping Indigenous peoples, especially women and two-spirited folk. It's talking about the loss of language, so the severed tongue and our inability to speak it. But it's also talking about an assertion and a playfulness that we are still here as well. And so both pieces are talking about language in very blunt ways, but in very different ways. The tongue piece is something interactive, and so hopefully when you come to the gallery there'll be more tongues so you can take one home with you to talk about the implicit nature of eating someone's language and what that means, but also the ephemeral nature of language. If it's not stewarded and taken care of and embodied, that we lose it. And so these are important aspects I'm thinking about within the Canadian context. Yeah, that's a really good question. I love that question. I'm an interdisciplinary maker, so I work in all kinds of mediums. So the medium is never the driving force for me, but it's actually the concepts of the driving force. And so it's kind of an interesting show because you get to see 2 parts of my practice. So the porcupine quill work, as I talked about, is a part of a traditional practice that I'm carrying through, but I want to regenerate it into something that is kind of different or new to me, so I can explore porcupines as a different kind of medium. So for me, my concern is really thinking about the non-human relationship and my relationship to the porcupine quills, and to talk about assertion and protection in different ways. So while it's a traditional medium that's been used since time immemorial, it's also something that I think we can explore in more of a conceptual context. And the sugar is something I've been working with since actually 2012. So in my undergrad, I started working with sugar just as a way to stiffen fabric and make body molds. So I was already kind of working with these aspects. And then in grad school, I really started thinking through what sugar means to an Indigenous population. So of course, when we look at the material of sugar, there's a lot of connotations. We look at the transatlantic slave trade. We look at indentured labor, decimating of communities. But in an Indigenous context, it could be seen differently too. And so I started using it as the actual medium, not just a device to stiffen something or to create something, but rather as the medium of conversation. And so for me, sugar talks a lot about food sovereignty within my own nation. And is a placeholder for thinking about sublimation. So while there's wonderful brilliance within my community and my family and our lineage, like the quill work, but there's also a very real history of colonialism that has affected our Indigenous history. And sugar is one of those main proponents. The way that we supplement through trauma, everyone supplements through trauma differently. So I'm looking at sugar as something that's a placeholder for things like overeating, body harm, drug addiction, alcoholism, all those different aspects, and food sovereignty in general. So thinking about the effect that like war and famine and colonial power structures have had on Indigenous people, which can lead to trauma, but also just the inability to connect with our land in the ways that we used to traditionally. And things are definitely changing and looking good, but I definitely see within my own community and others that type 2 diabetes is a huge problem. Heart disease is a huge problem. And so I'm looking at sugar as this kind of colonial through of something that we should be exploring and thinking about in different ways. And so I'm using that in different contexts too, because I'm very interested in the body. And I'm interested in the body because I'm interested in the flesh in many ways. As a Indigenous woman who is half Indigenous and half settler, who's white passing, I think about the flesh a lot. I was raised by brown bodies, but I'm this like white looking person. And so I think it's always been really interesting to me, the body. And I'm interested in blood memory, as I've mentioned before, and like healing practices. And I think these conversations over these kind of colonial constructs can help us break through and heal and bring us to the brilliance of our peoples instead of the decimation of our peoples. But storytelling is really important. And usually I actually introduce myself as, I'm first and foremost a citizen of the Metepenagiag Nation, but I'm also a storyteller. And I think that's really important because I think that's what I am. Maybe artist I'm definitely an artist, but I think more storyteller. And that's what all the work in this show is talking about, is stories of our language, of our cultures, and of our assertion to have a place in the world and a voice in the world. So it's all about language. Oh, so many. So the sugar tongues came because, actually, do you know Liz Howard? Liz Howard is a phenomenal Indigenous poet that is from the Takaranto area. And I had the pleasure of meeting her when I was in my grad school program at the University of Buffalo. And she writes texts about the severed tongue. And so I was already thinking about language revitalization, and all these aspects. But she really got me onto thinking about what does it mean to lose your tongue, like in a very visceral, physical way. And so this is a big inspiration for the start of this work. And so I started making just tons of molds. So I use a material called alginate, which I'm sure you're all familiar with because you use it when you go to the dentist to take molds of your teeth. And so I casted my tongue in various positions. But of course, you only have so much of your tongue that you can expel to cast, because most of your tongue is actually further back in your head. And so I would cast the top tip of my tongue, so I have about 4 of them, and then I would add on to that cast and then create more casts. So that's why some of them are longer, some of them are shorter, but they all start off with the tip of my physical tongue, which is kind of wonderful and gross, because the reception of the work when I first showed it in 2019 was disgust. People thought it was gross. But it's interesting to see here at On-Site Gallery, folks coming in and they're extremely excited about this sugar popsicle and putting it in their mouths. And to me, that's that's beautiful. It talks about connection, and maybe it took a pandemic and us having to be really afraid of each other for us to want to be with and around each other more. So I use, for this installation, there's about 5 different tongues. So there is variations of the casts, but they all stem from about that much of my original tongue. and the rest is like built up or not built up. Some of them are just that amount. Yeah. Really, this is like a very small piece. I mean, you do iteration, so there's many tongues, but I do full life cast size of people in sugar. And so that encounter is much different, right? It's much, like that's antagonistic, but that's like cheekily antagonistic. The bodies, when it's the full body, can be pretty cerebral when you enter a space, like you're met with a cadaver almost. And life casting is weird because it feels more real than a real body does. It's like really creepy, but I love mold making, so it's a fun process. Yeah. Well, of course, this is like directly talking about the medicalization or the kind of transition from Western, traditional medicine to Western medicine, but it also talks about the archive in a huge way. And as we know, the archive has been used in really violent ways against racialized people all across the globe, And so to see something in a jar put away, like to preserve it, is kind of, in one, it can be amazing because you get to see something, like the Ripley's Believe It or Not, like this wild thing in a jar, but it also is extremely violent. Like, how did this get here? Who took this? Where did this come from? So the archive is interesting, and it does tie to the quill work, because the first time I saw quill work, actually, I saw it through a museum glass door, like display case. I must have been like 5 or 6 years old, and I went to like a field trip. I grew up in Calgary, Alberta, which is very far away from my traditional home territory, where my mom is from. But I remember going to the Glenbow Museum and seeing this beautiful quill box. I don't know if you're familiar with quill box, but they're on birch bark, and they're pierced in with an awl, and you get these really ornate, beautiful, patterned and colored boxes you can hold many different things in. But they had this quill box and a chair cover, and it was the first time in my life, like as a child, seeing my nation's name, like on display, and like proud. Like people were like, this is amazing and beautiful. And so thinking about that encounter with the quill work, in one moment it was, pride and excitement, but also kind of disgust, like this isn't in my home territory for my own people. And that's in a way also like looking at the tongues in that way too, as some sort of like archive, or like hearkening to what the archive does or can be, in sense of violence, because it is violent, yeah. Not to say that there isn't good archival work being done, because there definitely is. It's complicated. That's a great question. So I collect all my quills through roadkill. I mean, I guess there's like some people like follow porcupine and put a blanket on it and then take the quills, But I always collect from roadkill. And so actually this came at a really interesting time. It was about 2 years ago, and I was about to have a show and I really needed more quills. I literally prayed to the creator, and like that day, my cousin Amara, her mother lives in Caledonia, and messaged me, it was in the middle of the winter, and said, hey, we just found a porcupine. And it was winter, so it's like preserved, it's cold, so you don't get all like the problems with it. And they collected it, brought it back to their mom's house, and her 7-year-old daughter processed the porcupine for me. And it was the first time they've ever done it. So we were on the phone, and they're like I'm like giving them instructions, and they did it. And so there was a moment of intergenerational learning there that was really sweet for me. And they left a tobacco offering, which is nice. So it's roadkill. So it's another way of thinking about our non-human relations and how we pay homage to them too. A lot of the work that I make is about paying homage and talking with our ancestors. And I include those porcupines as part of my ancestry as well. But that's how I get my quills. So that is pretty sweet. I have so many quills still from that. So and I like to reuse them. So that installation that's in the gallery, the quill work installation, has been showed twice. This is the 3rd iteration actually, and I'm using the same quills every time. So you're building a relationship with each quill. When you see it, you'll see it's very painstakingly done, but very simple at the same time. So it's a beautiful piece. 2 days, yeah. So I had a studio assistant, so she helped me, and that was great, and that helped a lot because it goes from like mapping it out, putting holes into the wall. I use an awl and a tiny drill, and then inserting every single one. So it takes a lot of time. So I would say like 16 to 19 hours to set up that piece. And so I'm interested in like endurance work. So I do a lot of performative work too, and it all deals with endurance healing practices. And I think that this work too is also about endurance. It's about iterations, the tongues, so many of them, seeing them again and again, but also the quill work in multiples, you know, and doing things again and again. I'm interested in that. It's like a methodical way of spending time thinking through these kind of bigger concepts, especially when we think about violent concepts. Personally, I never want to work with these kind of overarching and violent concepts without the time. Like, I need the time to sit through them, to think through them, to process it. Otherwise, it becomes too overwhelming. And it's better to do it with people and in community, you know. That makes everything a lot easier too, instead of by yourself. I think that all the work that I make is very performative, and it's something that keeps happening. I don't mean it to be that way, but it is performative. So the process is just as important as the final piece, or maybe sometimes more. You know, when I do like the bigger sugar casted bodies, I'm doing that with a lot of people. It's not something you do alone. You require a lot of assistance and a lot of help and a lot of iteration. And for me, like the act of teaching how to do it and of understanding when the sugar is ready, like I can hear it at this point. I know exactly when it's ready. I don't have to look at it. I can hear it. It gets to a certain bubble. And teaching someone that skill is really, that's the important part. And I think that talks about language too, you know. Using language is extremely important, of course, but it's the teaching of language that almost becomes more important. So language teachers are everything. So we should always be thankful for them. Well, I think that most people do, whether or not they acknowledge it, because you don't make work in the silo. Like, you're both artists, artistic people. Like, you don't make work by yourself. Even if you're physically making something by yourself, it's never by yourself. You know, I have a practice of like talking with my ancestors. They're always there, like consulting with them, consulting with my family, you know, talking to your friends over with ideas, thinking about who teaches you physically how to do something, whether or not they're there now or it's in 30 years. Like, you're never doing it alone. And I think that it's important to acknowledge community in that aspect. And it's important to have that, especially, again, with work that can be harder to process or can be traumatic. It's essential. Otherwise, you just burn out. You know, you need support.